Look, Mom, it's a pancreas. So the islets of Langerhans are always thought to be much more extensive than people realize. You see, islets of Langerhans are only 2% of the total volume of a pancreas. That's why they look like little islands in the middle of the pancreas. They look like little islands because they're interspersed in 98% exocrine function. See, the major function of the pancreas in terms of volume is really, 80 to 90% is exocrine, meaning that you have bicarb-rich fluids, enzymes, amylase, lipase, trypsin, chymotrypsin, and only 2% of it is islet cells. And of those islet cells, about two-thirds of them, 65-70%, 60, 65, 70, 75% of it is beta cells. 15 or 20% of it is alpha cells, which make glucagon, and only a small number, 5 or 10% delta cells, that make somatostatin. So they're called islets of Langerhans because when Langerhans was dissecting pancreases, he said these look like little islands in there. Very good name, don't you think? Now this summarizes the islets of Langerhans. Beta cells make insulin. Well, to be precise, they make proinsulin, which turns into proinsulin, which turns into insulin. And the C-peptide comes off at the end. So to be precise, it makes proinsulin as it's processed through. Delta cells are small. They make somatostatin. Somatostatin inhibits everything. Somatostatin never met a hormone it didn't like to inhibit. So somatostatin is the regulator, the counter-regulatory hormone throughout the entire body that slows down the production of all the other hormones. Alpha cells make glucagon, and glucagon is something that we're going to be paying an increasing amount of attention to because it's become so indispensable in the management of diabetes. Suppressing glucagon with the incretin drugs, and the incretin drugs that increase glucagon-like peptide and glucose insulinotropic peptide are indispensable. So the bionic pancreas has been invented and approved, and it is a pancreas that you can actually implant and will secrete both insulin and glucagon to balance people out. So pay attention to glucagon more than you used to. So the pancreas really makes proinsulin, then that's turned into proinsulin, which then has the C-peptide chopped out of it. Now, one of the reasons why this is important is because we have to know what's made in active and inactive form, and insulin originally is made in inactive form. Also, insulin from outside the body does not have a C-peptide. So one of the ways that we can tell whether or not somebody has an insulinoma or whether or not they've been getting insulin from outside themselves is that exogenous insulin has no C-peptide. So if you have a person who you're trying to evaluate to see, do they have an insulinoma or do they have an exogenous overdose, you can determine this by the C-peptide level. The insulin receptors, well, I wouldn't say unique, but there's not that many things that have an insulin receptor of tyrosine kinase. The insulin receptor is tyrosine kinase, which acts like a revolving door. So one portion is to the outside world, and the other portion's in the cytosol, the cell blood. And when it is occupied by insulin, the receptor autophosphorylates and helps take glucose inside it. Now, this is why growth hormone makes IGF, and why is IGF called insulin-like growth factor? You see, there's nothing insulin-like about growth hormone. Growth hormone raises glucose. Growth hormone raises free fatty acids. Growth hormone, for all intents and purposes, is in fact a whopping anti-insulin. Growth hormone is an anti-insulin that raises glucose and raises free fatty acids, and that's why people with acromegaly die of congestive failure and coronary disease. It's called insulin-like growth factor because the insulin-like part is the effect on protein and the effect on having a tyrosine kinase receptor. The IGF is insulin-like because it uses a tyrosine kinase receptor. Now, tyrosine kinase receptors in general are a hotbed of activity because a lot of cancer chemotherapy runs through tyrosine kinase receptors. So insulin and IGF in the normal hormonal system are the two hormones that run through the tyrosine kinase mechanism. So the peripheral uptake of glucose is by peripheral tissues, but facilitated diffusion. That's GLUT 1, 2, 3, 4. That's glucose transporters, facilitated diffusion. Actually, that's what goes up when you exercise. 15 minutes of aerobic exercise puts GLUT4 receptors into your muscles for 24 hours. Glucose is taken up peripherally by facilitated diffusion. Now, the other thing about insulin is that resting muscle needs insulin. Exercising muscle does not. And knowing the tissues which must have insulin is indispensable for our test. You see, adipose tissue and resting muscle must have insulin. That's why obesity causes diabetes, because insulin has to be used for adipose. That's why exercise helps get rid of diabetes, because exercising muscle does not need insulin. And in the liver, insulin really accelerates the uptake of glucose by that liver a lot. Now, the other biggies are that you do not need insulin for your brain, for the intestines, or the kidneys. Now, the kidneys and the intestines is secondary active transport. And the whole point is that secondary active transport does not need insulin. Secondary active transport does not need insulin. In red cells and in beta cells in the pancreas, glucose just diffuses across. But there's a lot in this little table, more than you might think, because this little table here underlies why does weight loss improve your diabetes? Why does weight gain cause diabetes? Because adipose tissue has to have insulin. Why does exercise get rid of your diabetes? Because exercising muscle does not need insulin. And it actually puts GLUT4 receptors into your muscle for 24 hours. Muscles break down. Proteins break down. Proteins break down without insulin. So proteins break down without insulin, so we need to have insulin if we want to form proteins. That's why if you really want to build muscles, you exercise, you drink protein, and you can take a shot of insulin if you wanted to. Make sure you don't get a fatal hypoglycemia, though. It's an anabolic hormone. Estrogens and testosterone are anabolic hormones. And it ends up with carbohydrates or proteins. That's one of the things. Proteins increase insulin. Amino acids increase insulin because insulin builds proteins. The other thing is, if you eat more protein than you need for the day, what happens to those amino acids? They get turned into sugar, then into fat, then into storage. If you take in more protein, you'd be amazed at how many medical students say, "Oh yeah, man, you're taking more protein, you'll just make more protein, man, yeah." It's like, what planet are you from? You can't make protein just by drinking protein shakes. If you don't need the protein, your body will secrete insulin. The insulin will turn it into sugar and storage and will turn it into fat in storage by stimulating lipoprotein lipase. The other anabolic hormones are thyroid, IGF, and the sex hormones, estrogen and testosterone especially. How come bodybuilders don't abuse thyroid hormone? Because under conditions of excess, thyroid hormone will melt your body. It will melt it. Under conditions of excess, growth hormone and IGF will form more protein. Testosterone will form more protein. But under conditions of excess, your thyroid hormone will start to consume your proteins for lunch. Insulin will take glucose up into muscle and fat and put it into storage as glycogen. It will put it into storage as fat. Insulin increases amino acid uptake by muscle cells. Proteins tend to break down without insulin. So therefore, insulin increases protein synthesis and decreases protein breakdown. So amino acids will go into the muscle cells and will increase protein synthesis and decrease protein breakdown under the effect of insulin. Insulin will increase glucose uptake into fat cells. Now, this is one of the reasons that sulfonylureas are no longer considered first-line therapy for diabetes. Because what ends up happening with sulfonylureas is that sulfonylureas increased insulin release in the pancreas. When they increased insulin release in the pancreas, they put more glucose into storage. And that made you fatter, and the fatter increased the insulin resistance. By putting the triglycerides into the fat cells and triglyceride into storage in fat cells, it made you fatter and therefore worsened your glucose intolerance. So it will decrease lipolysis and decrease the formation of ketones. In other words, if it puts fat into storage, it means it decreases fat breakdown. And isn't that saying the same thing? I'm forming fat in storage. I'm decreasing fat breakdown. That's two different ways of saying the same thing. So this image of an adipose cell summarizes it out. You see, it takes glucose and puts it into storage, eventually as triglycerides. Triglycerides are certainly cleared out by a lipoprotein lipase. Also, amino acids go into cells, and excess amino acids can be put into storage as fats. But everything that comes out of the fat cell comes out as free fatty acids. You can't take glucose and amino acids and put them in storage as fat and have them come out as anything except fat. It is a one-way street. It gets put into storage as fat and comes out as fat, as a one-way street. So in other words, you can't release amino acids from fat cells after they are put into storage. Everything goes into storage as fat, and they only come out as free fatty acids. Insulin increases the effect of sodium-potassium ATPase. Now, this is part of the reason why insulin lowers potassium. When you have hyperkalemia, and that potassium is dangerously high, we give glucose and insulin to people, and it drops the potassium level very quickly. Now, if you have EKG changes, we give you calcium chloride or calcium gluconate on top of that, so that the insulin has 10 or 15 or 20 minutes to work to lower your potassium. But we routinely use insulin and sugar to lower potassium levels in dangerous hyperkalemia. It's both more effective, higher volume, and more rapid than giving inhaled beta agonists or giving diuretics. Inhaled beta agonists only work on the lung. Diuretics work on the kidney. But the insulin will work on all the cells in the body, especially muscles and fat cells. So let's summarize the insulin actions around the body. And they're all going to seem like I'm going to say the same thing twice. In the liver, it puts glucose into storage as glycogen. Well, doesn't that mean it decreases glycogenolysis? It puts protein into storage and protein synthesis. That means it decreases urea, because urea is a breakdown product of protein. Well, it forms lipids in storage, lipogenesis. Wasn't that the same thing as saying decreases ketogenesis? Yes, it is. It increases the uptake of sugar into muscle, too, and therefore forms glycogen in muscle, proteins in muscle. But it also decreases the breakdown of glycogen in muscle. I'm saying the same thing twice, aren't I? Isn't it saying the same thing to say in fat cells. It increases lipogenesis, but decreases lipolysis. Yes, I think it's saying the same thing twice. Let's look at what controls insulin secretion. Well, somatostatin inhibits everything. Somatostatin never met a hormone it didn't like to inhibit. So somatostatin shuts down insulin release. Why does sympathetic stimulation shut down insulin release? Well, at the time that we're trying to make food available for running away is the wrong time to put it into storage. So sympathetic stimulation means that we're running away. We're under conditions of fight and flight. Help, 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 help. I got to run away from dinosaurs. Well, that's the wrong time to say put it into storage. So sympathetic, particularly alpha, prevents it from going into storage so that we can eat it. Glucose and amino acids, well, they certainly increase insulin because we want to put them into storage and amino acids to form proteins. Why does glucagon need insulin? Because glucagon needs the insulin to bring the sugar into the cells. You see, glucagon can't get sugar into cells. Glucagon needs the insulin to bring the sugar into a cell. Glucagon can raise the blood glucose, but it can't get it into a cell. It's kind of like saying, I need a waiter. I need a waiter to bring that glucose into the cell. Glucagon's like the cook. Hey, man, I just brought out sugar and free fatty acids. I just had the liver make sugar, but I can't get it into the cell so it can be used. I need insulin. Glucagon needs insulin to help the sugar get into cells. What about these intestinal hormones, GIP and GLP? GIP and GLP are indispensably important for us to know. They are also known as incretins. They go up when food hits the duodenum, particularly carbohydrates. They stand for glucagon-like peptide, which is a terrible name, GLP, because it doesn't like glucagon, suppresses glucagon. And glucose insulinotropic peptide. These are why oral glucose raises insulin more than IV glucose, because they stimulate insulin release from beta cells. When these are metabolized, they have a very short half-life, 2 minutes. But we use drugs that block their metabolism, sitagliptin, saxagliptin, linagliptin, sitagliptin, saxagliptin, linagliptin, so that we can keep a higher half-life of them, and they can raise glucose and suppress glucagon. Raise glucose and suppress glucagon. We can replace them synthetically with exenatide and liraglutide. We can block their metabolism with sitagliptin, saxagliptin, linagliptin, allogliptin. Incretins are known as GIP and GLP. We block their metabolism with sitagliptin, saxagliptin, linagliptin, allogliptin. We can replace them with exenatide. And this is the wave of the future in diabetes management. What are the actions of glucagon? Well, glucagon, though you might think it means glucose went away, it went gone, really means to bring back glucose. Glucagon also brings back free fatty acids. Glucagon is a hormone of energy. It counterbalances the insulin. Insulin puts things into storage. Glucagon takes them out of storage. Glucagon raises glucose and free fatty acids. Glucagon makes your liver make new glucose with gluconeogenesis. Glucagon does not break down proteins, but it does prevent them from forming. And most important, glucagon is a liver hormone. Now, it may be made in the pancreas, but its target is all liver. It's made in the alpha cells of the pancreas, but the target cell is cyclic AMP as the second messenger in hepatocytes, and it makes protein kinase A and zing, zang, zoom, phosphorylation activation end. Remember, the target is not the skeletal muscle. Not directly. The glucose may end up at the skeletal muscle later on, but the primary target of effect of glucagon is not being at the skeletal muscle. The sugar is to support it, but glucagon will not break down glycogen at the skeletal muscle. It'll break down glycogen at the liver. So glucagon on the liver will increase glycogenolysis, breaking down glycogen in storage. It'll increase gluconeogenesis, which means it takes amino acids and turns them into sugar. Because it also breaks down proteins, no, it breaks down lipids. So it breaks down lipids and therefore forms ketones, because insulin and glucagon go in opposite directions. Insulin decreases ketones, glucagon increases ketones. Now, urea happens because it doesn't break down proteins exactly, but it does convert them over into sugars. So urea goes up. Again, it may seem contradictory why glucagon increases insulin if insulin lowers glucose. Glucagon raises the blood level of glucose, but then it needs something to bring it into the cells. And insulin brings it into the cells. It breaks down lipids in the liver. So you might think that glucagon would be an awfully good thing for non-alcoholic steatohepatosis. Yes, it would. Because NASH, non-alcoholic steatohepatitis, or making foie gras in your own pancreas and liver, is something that's very dangerous, all that fat building up in the liver, but glucagon will break it down. So what controls the release of glucagon? Well, certainly, since glucagon raises glucose levels, high glucose will shut it off. And although insulin will put things into storage, it doesn't want glucagon to raise the blood glucose levels, because insulin puts things into storage and glucagon takes them out of storage. Somatostatin inhibits everything. Somatostatin never met a hormone it didn't like to inhibit. Low sugar is the major stimulant to glucagon. Low sugar makes the glucagon go up, so that glucagon will bring back the sugar. Why do amino acids like arginine increase glucagon? Well, the answer is that amino acids are converted into sugar. This is part of the mechanism that when you take in a person's got excess amino acids, such as they're having protein excess, people who decide that they're going to take in 6,000 calories a day with protein, and they don't understand you can't build muscle by just taking in that protein. The excess proteins get turned into sugar. And one of the mechanisms of how that happens is with glucagon. Excess proteins get turned into sugar with glucagon. So glucagon increases in response to amino acid ingestion. So after the muscles and proteins absorb all the amino acids they need, the excesses can turn it into glucose, and the glucose makes the insulin go up, and the insulin puts it into storage first as glycogen, then by stimulating lipoprotein lipase, because lipoprotein lipase is sometimes called clearing factor lipase. Clearing factor lipase, because then it takes the fats and the glucose and puts them in the storage with lipoprotein lipase. Lipoprotein stores. Lipoprotein lipase stores things. Now here's one of those confusing diagrams, which to the people who write it always look extremely clear, don't they? Yes, somewhere around here, this is like a treasure map for national treasure. Yes, I see this. Let's see. The original Constitution is buried under Trinity Church in the Secret Lives of Charlotte, and it's in here somewhere. Well, this is a summary slide of everything we just said. There's actually nothing new in it. If it clears it up for you, pause it and look. If it doesn't clear it up for you, there's nothing new. Skip it. Insulin-glucagon ratios are very accurate, actually. Insulin-glucagon ratios, because they move in opposite directions. A normal post-absorption ratio, meaning that after you eat, you should be making more insulin than glucagon. So after you eat, you need more insulin to put things into storage. However, what you need to do also is that when you need things to be mobilized, the ratios change. And mobilization means that you need to take things out of storage. So when you have a carbohydrate meal and you have all that glucose going in, the ratio goes to 10 to 1. And what does that mean? Is because you have GIP and GLP. You have glucagon-like peptide, which doesn't like glucagon. You have glucagon-like peptide, which inhibits glucagon. Well, why do you call it glucagon-like if it doesn't like glucagon? Because chemically, it's similar to glucagon. However, in its effect, it diminishes glucagon. And there's glucose insulinotropic peptide. That's why the insulin level goes up in response to carbohydrate meals, because all that extra sugar stimulates insulin like crazy, and this is why oral sugar has a greater insulin effect than IV sugar. Protein and fat ratios don't change things much because proteins and fats don't have a direct stimulatory or inhibitory effect on insulin and glucagon. Not too much. A little bit with the amino acids, but they balance it out. Since amino acids make insulin go up and amino acids make glucagon go up, the ratio doesn't change. And fat doesn't have an effect on either one of them.